Hi there. Thanks for joining us for Programmers Week. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Darren Oh. I'm a Drupal engineer at Cognizant Softvision, where I help to maintain the e-commerce platform for Estee Lauder. I've been with the company for 9 years. I'm really excited to talk about the business case for open source contribution. This presentation is a continuation of discussions that I've had with people in the past. Do you doubt the business case for open source contribution? Do you see open source contribution as vanity work? Do you think people choose to contribute to open source software because they aren't trying to make a profit, either because they can afford to do that or they just prefer it aesthetically, emotionally, philosophically, theologically, spiritually? Maybe some people do. I encourage everyone to share your questions in the chat module so we can consider them at the end of this presentation. So let's get started. For those of you who are not familiar, open source software is software whose programmers allow users to copy, modify, and share their code. And businesses who contribute to open source software voluntarily share control of their products with users and competitors. Isaac Newton said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Progress requires the ability to build on what has come before. This is especially true in the world of software. The availability of code that we can use and modify without permission has vastly accelerated modern software engineering. While many engineers would enjoy writing their software from scratch, most take advantage of the speed and security made possible by using open source code. More and more companies realize that maintaining technical leadership requires working with open source. I visualize progress as a jigsaw puzzle. Every time I connect a new piece to the puzzle, I see more of the picture. In closed source competition, companies compete for exclusive access to the most valuable parts of the picture. Each company divides its part of the picture in its own way and forbids customers from modifying the pieces to prevent them from using competitors' pieces to complete the picture. I heard a funny story about this kind of competition from when Philips and Sony were collaborating to create a digital audio standard back in 1979. Philips argued that the format should be based on an existing 11.5 centimeter, 60-minute disc that they could already manufacture. Sony did not want Philips to have a head start on manufacturing. So Sony argued for a new 12 centimeter, 75-minute disc that could hold all of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Philips objected that a 12 centimeter disc would not fit in the pocket of a suit jacket. So Sony researchers measured the pockets of suit jackets in Europe, Japan, and the United States and found they were all at least 14 centimeters wide. Sony won the argument, and Philips had to retool its factories. In closed source competition, engineers cannot use each other's work without permission. Companies create mediocre products with the source code available to them, and customers are frustrated because the features they need cannot be combined into a single product. Closed source competition has become a severe obstacle to progress. It makes some complex projects impossible because companies seeking to maximize the value of their puzzle pieces can block the whole project. Closed source competition is backward-looking. Competitors focus on controlling access to what they created in the past instead of on what they can build in the future. So how did we get here? A big reason for the growth of the closed source business model has been the spread of the United States patent and copyright system. Copyright and patents were created to accelerate the contribution of innovation to the public domain. If you imagine the full body of human knowledge as a jigsaw puzzle, patents and copyrights were intended as incentives for adding new pieces to the puzzle. This is clear from the clause in the United States Constitution that gives Congress the power to grant patents and copyrights. Here is what that clause says they are for: to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. These exclusive rights have steadily been expanded to the point where they slow down progress instead of promoting it. Today, innovation is considered a form of private property. The business model has become to prevent customers from being able to patronize your competitors. Closed source competition weakens all competitors. The need to obtain permission to build on past innovation is a barrier to fresh innovation. What would really accelerate innovation is free competition. Clever engineers have realized they do not have to wait for laws to change to make this possible. Instead, they can use the copyright system against itself by making free competition part of the license under which they release code. Some open source software licenses simply give everyone equal rights to use, modify, and distribute the code. Other open source licenses are viral. Under certain conditions, viral licenses require users to contribute their modifications to others under the same license. The best known example is the GPL, or General Public License, which requires users who distribute modified software to make the source code available for 1 year under the same license. Version 3 of the GPL forbids using patents to attack other users of the software. The Affero General Public License requires code to be made available for software that is delivered as a service instead of being run by customers. Viral licenses channel everyone's effort into one great product instead of duplicating efforts on multiple mediocre products. In open source competition, engineers borrow freely from each other's work. Companies compete to create products by enhancing the best code available to all. And customers are delighted because they can find products that exactly match their needs. Open source competition is forward-looking. Competitors focus on what they can create in the future instead of on controlling access to what they built in the past. The companies I work for have all been convinced of the benefits of harvesting code from the open source ecosystem to use in their projects. But I have repeatedly encountered skepticism about the benefits of companies contributing to the open source ecosystem themselves. My first full-time development job was creating an e-commerce site for a small music label. My boss complimented me one day on my progress, and I responded, "We're making the world better, one line of code at a time." I remember him saying, "That's not what our business is about." I was let go soon after. My next job was full of developers who wanted to create their own forks of open source projects or write code from scratch. One developer called it job security. In my current job, I have colleagues who question the point of contributing because they see the open source business model as unsustainable. To be fair to the skeptics of open source contribution, let me explain the doubters' case. Doubters see a free rider problem in the open source ecosystem. Imagine that some buses allowed passengers to ride without paying a fare. Instead, riders would be asked to show gratitude for their free rides by voluntarily contributing to a bus maintenance fund. People who wanted to save money would choose to ride the free buses. Some might feel grateful enough to contribute to the maintenance fund, but the voluntary contributions would never equal what riders would have paid if the rides were not free. The riders who would benefit most from free rides would be those who contributed least to the bus maintenance fund. As riders saw most of the benefits of contribution going to those who did not contribute, fewer riders would contribute. Maintenance and quality of service would suffer. Eventually, the remaining contributors would see that the free bus system was unsustainable and free bus service would cease. The free rider problem does threaten many open source projects. Docker, Elasticsearch, Redis, and MongoDB are prominent examples of open source projects that have been threatened by free riders competing against contributors. But the open source ecosystem as a whole has continued to grow. To understand why, let's imagine a free bus system that does not try to operate like a commercial bus system. In this free bus system, buses are jointly owned by contributors. Contributors decide how big buses need to be, where the routes need to be, how often they should run, and where the bus stop should be built. Rides would be free, but contributors would board first. In this scenario, the free bus system has a good chance of outcompeting the commercial bus system because every rider has a strong incentive to become a contributor. Those of us who are not business people can overlook the fact that many business models depend on contribution to generate value. There are both taker and maker business models. In a taker business model, contribution represents a loss of value. If all businesses were takers, the open source ecosystem would have to be sustained entirely by free labor. We would expect most open source software to be free only for non-commercial use. But most open source licenses make software free for all users because authors believe that the more businesses depend on it, the more it will be in their interest to help maintain it. To understand why, let's compare taker and maker business models. Mining is an example of a taker business model. I live in a phosphate mining area. A mining company leases land for as long as it takes to extract the phosphate it contains. Once the phosphate has been extracted, the mining company returns the land to its owners and moves on to another mine. If you were to suggest that it is in the mining company's interest to improve the soil on the land they mine, you would probably be laughed at, because the mining company has no way to capture the benefits of any improvements they make to the land. Farming is an example of a maker business. If a farmer leases land, it is in the farmer's interest to improve the soil, prevent erosion, and install irrigation, because these improvements make the land produce more for the farmer. Piracy is another example of a taker business model. It would be absurd to suggest that pirates should contribute something to the countries they plunder, because they generally have no stake in those countries' prosperity. In our industry, the equivalent of pirates are cyber criminals. Cyber criminals generally attack targets outside their countries to avoid giving their own governments a reason to pursue them. On the other hand, a market is an example of a maker business model. Everyone brings something to the market that they think would be more valuable to someone else than it is to them. The goal is to keep trading until everything belongs to the person to whom it has the greatest value. Maker business models generate value from contribution. And I believe that more company business models are on the maker end of the spectrum than on the taker end. That being said, contribution has to be done carefully to bring value to a business. Contributing to the open source ecosystem is not free. The social and personal rewards of contributing are enough to motivate me, but the time, equipment, and services I use have to be paid for. I follow 3 rules that keep my pace of contribution sustainable. Rule number 1, make sure your contributions are paid for. All of your work should be done for a customer who can use your work and pay for it. That customer can be you if you can afford yourself. My first open source contributions were paid for by the money I saved by not using commercial software and services that I couldn't afford. I needed some websites, and I didn't have the skills to write code from scratch. I had an 800 megabyte drive with Debian and PostgreSQL on it. This was back in 2005. And I chose to use Drupal because it ran on my system without requiring me to install anything else. I started reviewing and contributing fixes because I needed help from the Drupal community to get things working. Other users noticed my contributions and started paying me to help them. My next contributions were paid for by the money I saved by not going to college. I realized I could have a career as a software engineer if I improved my skills. I could choose between spending thousands of dollars to study programming or learning by helping to maintain open source projects. I decided to maintain open source projects and take freelance jobs as they became available. My wife was making just enough as a nurse to cover our expenses. I made a deal with her that if I didn't have a full-time job after a year, I would enroll in college. I had a full-time job in 6 months. Throughout my career, all my contributions to open source have been paid for. Rule number 2, form alliances with other contributors. Your goal is to spread the burden of contribution as widely as possible. An open source license may not allow you to make contribution a requirement to use your code, but you can use other forms of leverage. As a project maintainer, I gave preferential attention to other contributors. The Drupal community has a system for tracking all kinds of contributions from both individuals and organizations. Companies can use open source contribution as a factor in determining who they hire, what suppliers they use, who they give referrals to, and what other companies they partner with. Rule number 3 is prepare a succession plan. Your level of contribution should reflect a project's value to your business. As the needs of your business change, the open source projects you contribute to should change also. A good open source project won't depend on a single contributor or sponsor. You should be looking for people you can prepare to take over for you. Now that I have a full-time job, I have less time to spend maintaining my projects. Most of my projects are now retired or being maintained by others. If you make sure your contributions are paid for, form alliances with other contributors, and prepare a succession plan, you should be able to sustain your contributions to open source. Now, what business gains come from contributing to the open source ecosystem? These are just a few examples. One benefit is an expanded talent pool. Open source software is accessible to people before they join your company. Your open source contributions increase the number of people who can be ready to work for you on day one. Another benefit is increased adoption. Improvements to open source software attract more users who may in the future become employees and customers. Another benefit is to improve quality. Users are more willing to try out software when it is free, and public scrutiny helps problems to be caught before they affect your customers. Contributing allows you to influence the work of others. Your contributions can set the direction for future development. You can offer your contributions as incentives for others to contribute their work. Contributing expands your customer base. When you contribute to an open source project, your work is more likely to be adopted as an industry standard. This increases the base of potential customers for your company's services. By contributing, you increase brand awareness. Having your contributions adopted by an open source project benefits you and your existing customers directly and exposes new customers to your brand. By contributing, you build alliances. Open source contribution provides opportunities to establish mutually beneficial business relationships with other companies in your industry. And by contributing, you acquire skills. Contribution can train employees and test new capabilities for your company. You can do this in open source projects instead of risking relationships with important clients. Many successful companies make significant contributions to open source. Here are a few examples. Think about what benefits they gain by contributing. Apple, Google, and Microsoft all use the same open source code base for their web browsers, even though they are competitors. Microsoft now provides Linux cloud services and has contributed patches to enable Linux to run along with Windows. Before moving into cloud computing, Microsoft was struggling to grow its business and its share price was stagnant. In 2019, it became the third company to reach a $1 trillion market value. Red Hat bases its enterprise Linux distribution on an open source code base that it contributes to and which is also used to produce free Linux distributions. In 2018, IBM acquired Red Hat for $34 billion. Acquia is the largest contributor to Drupal, which it uses to provide software as a service and which thousands of other companies also use to provide services to their customers. Acquia puts great effort into nurturing the community of Drupal contributors and empowering new contributors. Acquia has grown to be a leading digital experience platform. Given all the business benefits of open source contribution, what might sustainable contribution from a business look like in practice? Well, if you have a project that is core to your business, I would recommend you adopt that project. You can put your brand on it. You can be the business that people come to when they have questions about that project. If a project is not so core to your business, but it's still important to you, you can sponsor a developer. This can either mean you help pay for someone outside your company to work on it, or you assign one of your own employees to do that. And if you just want to get general benefits from a contribution, you can allocate downtime to contribution. So when there's no demanding immediate client work, you can have a backlog of open source projects that your employees can work on. And contribution can take forms other than code. Non-programmers can create documentation and examples for users. Non-programmers can organize events that bring programmers together. They can test updates. You can pay hosting fees for a project's website. I would be negligent if I closed this presentation without mentioning how Cognizant Softvision contributes to the open source Firefox browser. In 2010, the Firefox community was starting to be overwhelmed by the challenge of maintaining a browser that could compete with commercial browsers. Users were abandoning Firefox. Firefox's QA directory asked Softvision to apply its professional processes to Firefox development. With our help, Firefox achieved a 400% increase in responsiveness in 2016. In 2017, Firefox Quantum released with double the speed of any previous Firefox version and 30% less memory consumption compared to Chrome. Nearly 100 associates in our Romanian studios contribute to Firefox as testers, programmers, and project managers. Our contributions have helped Firefox maintain quality and market share and brought visibility to our transformative approach to product delivery. In summary, I believe that both businesses and the open source ecosystem benefit when businesses are serious about treating open source contribution as a profit-making opportunity. If we cooperate to create a full picture instead of seeking exclusive access to our own parts of it, we all gain from accelerated progress. For those who are curious, the puzzle I used to illustrate my slides is a picture of Mount Elbrus, the highest mountain in Europe. I got this from Wikimedia Commons, and you can play the puzzle for free on iamapuzzle.com. Thank you for attending my presentation today. I hope it stimulates conversations about the opportunities that open source contribution offers to your business.